Welcome, friends. This is another program of Economic Update. We come to you every week on the Pacifica Network and affiliated stations with a program about what is going on in the economy we live in and depend on. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life at several universities. I currently teach in the graduate program for international affairs of the New School University in New York City. I also write economics columns for several online publishers, including truthout.org, an important and courageous daily repository of important news and analysis that I urge you to take a look at truthout.org. I also want, as I always do, to remind you to send me your comments and your questions to my website, rdwolff.com, that's with two F's, or democracyatwork.info. Both websites will process your questions and comments and help us in shaping our program and in responding, as we do towards the end of every program, to the questions that you send in. I want to also respond to a question many of you have sent in. If you find our analyses interesting and you want to pursue them, please go to the websites that we have, again, rdwolff.com or democracyatwork.info. There you will see all kinds of elaborated forms of what we also do here on the radio, and they're available to you 24 hours a day, free of charge. I also want to remind you that we can't possibly answer all of the comments and questions. There's simply too many, which we're very happy to get. But do bear with us, we can only select a few. Last thing, there is a newsletter, a free newsletter that is available on the websites, so you can follow this kind of information and have it brought to you, and we welcome you to sign up for that. So let's begin. We have a special guest, Barbara Garson, whom I will introduce in a few moments. But as we always do at the beginning, a few shorter economic updates. This last week was remarkable because there were airplane delays, both in Europe and in the United States, and indeed around the world. And they came from two very different reasons. You might say it's a tale of two delays, and they're very different, and there's a lot of meaning in them. Here in the United States, we had airline delays all over the place. Thousands of Americans, and foreigners too, were inconvenienced at countless airports. Why? Because the government sequester, that cutback in government programs that began March 1st, has now begun to impact our lives as we knew it would. And one of the places it impacted is in cutbacks and furloughs at the air traffic controller group, public employees that control how and when airplanes come and go from airports. There are fewer of them. They're not working as often because the government has to cut back spending on their salaries and so forth. And so tens of thousands of Americans lost time, lost work at their job. The cost of this way larger than whatever it is the government saved. An irrationality if you ever wanted to see one. In Europe and the rest of the world, there were also delays, but for a completely different reason. The largest trade union in Germany, Verdi it's called, struck the Lufthansa Airlines Corporation, shutting down virtually all Lufthansa flights except for a few across the Atlantic. Why? Because the union wants a better deal for the workers there. And they have been fighting, and they have built up strength, and they've gotten a better offer from the company than the company began with, but it's still not enough. They want the Lufthansa to share its profitability with its workers way more than they have. Very different reasons for this kind of an airline delay. One of them panders to cutbacks that help rich and corporations save taxes. The other one goes right after those same corporations to get a better deal for working people. My next update has to do with waiters and waitresses. And I take much of my information from a remarkable blog that was recently created by a very initiative person, person with a lot of initiative, Gina DeLuca, a waitress herself. Her blog is called Wiser Waitress and talks about something that I want to talk about too. Under the law in the United States, the minimum wage makes an exemption. If you are a person whose job involves tipping, the minimum wage doesn't apply to you, or rather, a much lower minimum wage applies to you. Since 1991, the federal minimum wage for a waiter or waitress or anyone who depends on tips is not the $7.65 that other workers have, but is $2.13 an hour. Think about it. Since 1991, the federal government has not raised the minimum wage for tipped workers above $2.13. That's what it was in 1991, and that's what it is now. All prices have gone up a lot since 1991, but not the minimum wage. True, the law says an employer should make sure that the tips a person gets bring him or her at least up to the $7.65 minimum wage. But many employers don't do it, and most workers who are in tipped places confirm that their employers never even asked about it. So depending on the mood of your customer, depending on the season, depending on many factors, your tips may or may not bring you up. What a discrimination against people who depend on tips, already an uncertain source of income. Why would you do that? That is sheer discrimination, and I don't need to comment to anyone listening to this program about what it means to be paid $2.13 an hour for your work time. But here's the good news. There are efforts in Congress, and there's some support from President Obama to finally do something about tipped minimum wage, to raise it. But here's even better news. 7 out of the 50 states in the United States have in fact already done it. In 7 states, the minimum wage for tipped workers is the same as the minimum wage for untipped workers. No discrimination against people who depend on tips. And that brings me to the state I admire most of the 50 in how it deals with the minimum wage. And that's the state of Washington in our Northwest. The state of Washington is one of the 7 that makes the minimum wage of tipped workers the same as the minimum wage of everybody else. And also the state of Washington has the highest minimum wage in the country. Not the $7.65, but rather the $9.19 that is the minimum wage for all workers in Washington. Simple question to the American people. If Washington can behave towards its minimum wage, its poorest workers, in that kind of a decent way, what possible excuse is there for the other 49? Let me turn next to a major story this last week, because it's important. It happened in Bangladesh, in a suburb of the capital there, Dhaka. A building collapsed. And at the latest count, according to the CNN, 142 garment workers were killed in the collapse of a building. And many hundreds more were injured, and many of them seriously. What's going on here? Well, let's begin with a few economic facts. Bangladesh depends on the garment industry. 80% of the exports of that country are garment exports, mostly to the United States and Europe, mostly to the big discount clothing outlets in this country, and some not discount outlets, that are making a fortune by no longer producing garments here in the United States, but instead producing them in the much cheaper wage locations of Asia. And Bangladesh, like China and so on, is a major place. Here's how it works. It's driven by profits at every step. Step number 1, A department store like Walmart or a big box store like The Gap decide they can make money by moving into an area that is now served by a whole bunch of smaller clothing stores. To make money, they can offer clothing more cheaply, wipe out the competition of those stores, drive everyone from the downtown of the little village or town or city to go to the suburban mall where they locate their stores. So profit destroys the little businesses across the United States. But in order to do that, Walmart, Gap, and all the others have to offer clothing cheaply, more cheaply than they could get it made here in the United States, where people get a decent wage. So they move to Bangladesh. But the pressure is on. We're going to buy clothes from you, but you've got to pay your workers very little. You've got to have very quick, simple, cheap places to build them, where we can throw the machines in quickly, where the rent isn't very high. So in order to get away with cheap clothing exports from Bangladesh, we have to pay the workers very little, and we have to have low rents for where the workers do the work, producing the gloves and the shoes and the handbags and the slips and the socks and all the rest. So the buildings get thrown up quickly, cheaply, so that the building owners can make money even though they have to charge low rents. So they cut corners on the building. Get the picture? Profit drives Walmart. Profit drives the people who make the clothes in Bangladesh. Profit drives the people who make the building in which the people make the clothes who pay the low wages. And then when you cut the corners on buildings, you have the disaster that we had this week. 142 dead people by a profit motive-driven system of moving production out of the United States. And the money saved on our clothing, is it worth it for destroying cities and towns across America because the little stores that used to keep the downtown alive selling clothing are gone? Is it worth it for the cities and towns that can't collect taxes from the destroyed little businesses? Is it worth it for the lost jobs that people had here? Is it worth it for the dead people in Bangladesh, all sacrificed in this profit-driven system? It's an important question. And if we don't ask it, it still leaves blood on the clothes we wear. Third topic for today, I wanted to bring to your attention some facts many of you have asked me about military expenditures, a topic that doesn't get the attention it wants. And here I found a very useful source. I'd like to mention it to you if you'd like to follow up. It's the Stockholm, that's as in Sweden, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They produce a lot of really good information where they study military expenditures across the world. And they have a new production, a new publication, Trends in World Military Expenditure 2012. And I'm just going to give you what I thought was the most important statistic there. In 2012, the United States accounted for 39% of global military expenditures. We are between 4 and 5% of the world's population, the United States, but we spend about 40% of money on military. We spend more than the 10 runner-up countries combined. Let me do that again. The United States spends more on military than the next 10 top military spending countries, Russia, China, England, and a whole bunch of others, combined. So we are a complete wild country when it comes to military expenditure. The average of countries spending on military in 2012 was 2.5% of their gross output, their GDP. 2.5% of the total goods and services they produced were military. In the United States, last year, 4.4%, nearly double. We are spending wild amounts by comparison with any other country on this planet on military. The total amount, Think about it. $1.75 trillion of output in this world goes to military equipment. Equipment designed to kill each other. Imagine a world that solved its problems in some other way and could devote $1.7 trillion to meeting the real needs of our people for health, jobs, rebuilt cities, schools, and all the other things we need. I wish, as always, I had time for more updates. I will next week. But now I have the pleasure to introduce to you my guest. She is Barbara Garson. So before I introduce her, welcome, Barbara, to the program.
Thank you.
Barbara is an author, quite a prolific author. She has written a number of books, including the one we're going to be discussing today. And that one is called Down the Up Escalator. And its subtitle is going to tell you what it's about: How the 99% Live in the Great Recession. The book has just been released, April 2013, by Doubleday Publishers, and this is a remarkable piece of work. Before I tell you about it, Barbara is the author of many books. This is not her first. She is also a playwright. You may have heard about the plays she wrote. They got quite a bit of attention. Mac Bird, perhaps the most well-known, and the Obie Award-winning The Dinosaur Door. Her written work has appeared in Harper's Magazine, The New York Times, Newsweek, and The Nation. This book can best be described as an attempt by Barbara to see and to explore what this recession that we're now in the 6th year of, what it means in literally the daily life, the personal life, the home life, the intimate life of American people. You know, we as economists, myself, talk about the Great Recession as having this effect on unemployment, that effect on home foreclosures, this effect on investment, on job conditions, and so on. And we do that in order to get a big picture. But I think it would be very helpful to have what you might call the little picture, the intimate picture, the personal picture. What does it mean to the people of America to be going through an economic crisis of these proportions? And before I begin talking with Barbara, let me read to you what a famous American author, Adam Hochschild, from Berkeley, California, where he hails, what he had to say about this new book. Barbara Garson knows that the hard times so many people are living through are not composed just of headlines about corporate profits, unemployment rates, and foreclosures. They're composed of human beings. This book is a compassionate, probing, pointillist mural of the Great Recession and of the decades-long erosion of the average American's economic position that preceded it, all told through the experiences of individual men and women. She has followed some over time, has sought out others whose lives illuminate larger social injustices, and she has found people whose stories will stick with you. Okay, Barbara.
Yes.
Let's jump into it. One of the things that has been a hallmark of this crisis has been the impact on people's living conditions.
Oh, boy.
Millions that have been thrown out of their homes, millions of others worried about their mortgages, even if they stay in their homes, the intensity, the anxiety, the fear, the adjustments. Tell us a little bit, as you interviewed people around the United States, how you came to understand not only what people are going through in the sense of what they're suffering, but also their coping. How are they handling these situations? And how does this part of the Great Recession shape their lives?
This part, the last part. Well, you know, I started with people who I started at the beginning, and people were just starting to lose their jobs. And so it feels bad whenever you lose your job. And it feels the same at first in a normal recession, and there are normal recessions, they're quite normal, and a Great Recession. And this Great Recession is different, not just for its size. But at first, so I was lucky enough, you might say, to meet people who had just lost their jobs, who had to console themselves at first, because that moment is, you look back on it like someone comes over, you're like jelly, you're like stiff or whatever you are, and people tell themselves, like to tell how they took it well. Oh, the woman said, you can go home now if you like. I said, no, I have work to finish. I have comrades. I have fellow workers who depend on me. That's one kind of person. Another person says, and I took this with me. Another person says, and it snowed the next day, and I was so happy I could stay home. People try to give a picture to themselves of how they behave decently. That's at first. I met a group of people who have doing very skilled jobs, really, not high paid, but New Yorkers, Manhattanites, who were in and out of each other's apartments, like Seinfeld. I gave them Seinfeld names. 4 people. They were all lost their jobs, so they formed something called a Pink Slip Club. They figured, well, we'll keep each other company. We live in Manhattan. We love it. That's why we pay the rents. Let's do something we wouldn't be able to go do for the few weeks we'll be unemployed. We'll go to free concerts in the afternoon. We'll play Scrabble together. That's when I first met them. I saw these people.
They were all convinced, I don't mean to interrupt,
absolutely,
that it would be a few weeks.
Yes, because they had remembered back. They were all around 50. They were all making about $50,000 a year in jobs in jobs that were an insurance adjuster, an editor on a trade paper, a third one did graphics layout for textbooks. These are skilled jobs, and they could remember back 20, 30 years ago the last time they needed a job, and they just asked around, and they had them before they had even the fun of being off for 3 weeks. So they just thought it would happen. And I followed them as weeks turned into months. They're sending their resumes out into the void. You put it online these days. You can't find out the name of the company that you checked all these websites. You can't get, you think you might know the company by the description of the job, but you can't get an extension number to contact anybody. You think you're up for a job because no one ever gets back to you and says, the place has been filled. These are people who are used to not being important people, but being treated better than that. They get to feel worse and worse. It turns from a personal thing into an economic thing. You have to take in a roommate. You're going into your IRA. Remember, we're talking semi-professionals. They became the long-term unemployed. And they're still long-term unemployed.
This is the recession that has longer average length of unemployment than any we have had for many, many decades. So this is one, this story you're telling really affects large numbers of Americans.
And I am good at it in describing the personalities. I mean, the answers on the telephone are less cheerful. The people were competent at first, and I know them some well. Various competences slip as you're home and you're thinking yourself as some kind of loser. Being with each other is very important to them in realizing that, hey, this is all around us. And that's an advantage that some people don't have. But, Richard, we have to look at something else. If they should get those same jobs back, or if another person should get those jobs, which is much more likely, throughout the course of this recession, and this is unusual in a recession, the same jobs have been being made worse. Time studies have gone on. In other words, employers say, I will take more people back. And they're doing time studies to make the work. I met a woman who worked in I called it the boutique. It was it's so well known that even I knew the fashion brand, and it has about 160 stores in the United States. And she was several years spaced out, the top commission maker in that company, because she really loved to dress people. Even when I came in, she looked and she said, I could get you a pair of petite black pants I'll let you know when there's a sale. She loved that job. And rich people would come in every year and say, oh, you know what I like, what have I got for you? That's the level of this, what have you got for me? That's the level the store was on. And she pointed out to me, during the recession, they said, listen, they took away commissions. They said, look, we're going to tell you each 2 weeks what your schedule will be for the next 2 weeks. And those schedules got shorter and shorter. And I said, well, did they say to you, thank you, this is just during the recession, thank you for helping us out? She said, no. And she said, I'll tell you something else. They're still hiring people. They simply want to change it to a place that's very different, that has no commissions, that has people working 4.5 hours so they don't have to pay them an hour's lunch, and are quite unskilled, and you won't get the same service. And she said, I'm going to stay because, you know, my husband's retired. I've got all my benefits from someplace else, no more health insurance. But I don't know what these other people can do because they're home, they're supporting their home. And now the job is for someone who's in college and needs a little money on the side. And indeed, all the other people did quit. And you know why they quit? The company offered them a very strange kind of separation benefit. They said, if you want to quit because of the changed conditions, we won't say to the unemployment insurance people that you quit. We'll let it go as we laid you off. So they were making, as a kind of a compensation, workers, you know, you can go collect unemployment insurance and we won't interfere with that. Well, Richard, you know you're not talking about a normal recession. In a normal recession, I know capitalists aren't generous, but in a normal recession, actually they share the pain. The percentage, the capitalists take a little less profit and hold their key workers and wait for business to pick up. Mm-hmm. That's the normal thing. And so the percentage that goes to wages during a recession actually goes up a little. The wages don't go up, but the percentage goes up. And the percentage of profit actually goes down a little. I'm not telling you that rich people got poor, penniless during recessions, or that poor people got rich, but it took the percentages at a little Robin Hood turn. They didn't this time. The kind of thing that I'm describing, lowering wages throughout the course of the recession, that's been going on. And profits are 25 to 30% higher now than at the official beginning of the recession. Right. And this is really unusual, and it's saying, we don't need these Americans anymore. It's just going to go downhill. This is not a recession. This is a permanent condition that you're going to be in.
And the recession is just a temporary opportunity, right, because of bad conditions, right, to actually push this decline faster and further.
Although it was going on before.
It was going before, but instead of this being reversed, it's being accelerated.
Right, and which means that the next will come very much sooner, because the main thing I found about everybody I talked to, personal conditions are varied, but almost everybody had really been going down for 30 years, or their parents. And so they borrowed a lot. And it wasn't abnormal. Well, anyway, you asked me something else before I go on.
Well, before you go on, I want to take you back to the question, right, how did all of this impact housing? I'm interested in your talking about how working people going through this recession, how did they handle losing a job when someone in the family did, in terms of housing, of affording their homes, of dealing with the pressure of rent or mortgage payments and so on? Well, what did you find talking to people?
If I describe to you, as I just did, how much profit has gone up over the last 40 years, you got to do something with that money. These sacks of profit got bigger and bigger, and a bank can't keep its money in the bank. So people I'm talking about whose wages got smaller after the recession, before the recession, during the recession, they didn't have the money to buy stuff. But the banks had money to lend them. And so, as I've heard Richard say so brilliantly, they got a great idea. Instead of paying you enough to buy what you produce, I'll lend you the money. And that actually produced this mortgage to people who couldn't pay the mortgages anyway scheme, and the crash that came when the banks that were selling those mortgages couldn't get them rid of them fast enough. So people who lost their jobs are sitting on houses they couldn't really afford in the first place. And so, I talked to very different kinds of people. Some people who were speculating themselves on their own houses. Aha, I can afford this house because I can sell it for twice as much in 10 days. They were very interesting. They were all over California. I never knew people like that. I mean, to my parents, your house is where you live, and what's good about it is it will keep pace with inflation, and if you have to sell it, you can move someplace, the same kind of house.
But remember, the banks were making so much money off of mortgages, of churning out mortgage after mortgage, lending people money, then taking that mortgage and selling it to an investor, that they were giving masses of Americans the idea you can become a speculator. It's called house flipping. You buy a house with a loan and you sell it a few months later at more money and you keep the difference and then you do it again. And all these people were caught up in a hustle.
I met people who were caught up in that hustle. Very interesting people. I met a mortgage hustler who sold great numbers of mortgages, and she thought this would actually work. Or that she had a 5-year plan. She thought it would crash, but she didn't think it would crash for 5 years. She made money selling mortgages, and she also bought into this thing herself. Took money out of her own house, bought 2 houses in Nevada. And she had a funny sense of honor. When the crash came, she didn't. She called all her customers back that she could reach to tell them, walk away from your house now. As soon as you realize the prices wouldn't go back up. Don't pay the bank. Walk away. Save your cash, not your credit. I mean, she was a funny lady, but that's a funny story, although she lives in a trailer right now. That's a funny story. But then there were so many, Richard.
Let me interrupt you. We need to take a short break. We need to take no problem, take a short break. Please stay with me. We'll be right back to continue the interview with Barbara Garson about the personal impact, the individual impact of the Great Recession. Welcome back, everyone. This is Economic Update. I'm Richard Wolff. I want to remind you again, as we did at the beginning of the program, that if any of these conversations and any of these economic updates are of interest, you can pursue that by going to rdwolf.com or to democracyatwork.info, or to subscribe to the free newsletter that you can find on both of those websites as a way to get more information, more analysis that fleshes out, in a way, what we can only begin to talk about at the program. I want to return with Barbara Garson, our guest today, the author of this remarkable book, Down the Up Escalator, How the 99% Live in the Great Recession. Barbara, I want to pull you again towards this question of how the housing crisis played itself out. What did you discover about how people dealt with that particular issue?
Well, I just described the people who were speculators, but, you know, before the recession, or rather before the mortgage mania, many neighborhoods were redlined, meaning that a bank didn't go into those areas and give mortgages. And it was unfair in the sense that they were usually black or Latino neighborhoods. And the bank, it's unfair, it's not nice, but the bank was thinking, I can't make loans to people who can't pay back. And unfortunately, or whatever they thought, these people have difficult income situations. They lose jobs, etc. Came the mortgage mania. Came the ability to get those mortgages off your books and sell them to somebody else in another country. The very redlined areas became, oh, that's where I can sell mortgages. And those neighborhoods had formerly been relegated to very crooked, well, they're not very fly-by-night and awful mortgage companies. Now, suddenly, the big banks bought those crummy mortgage companies. Goldman Sachs owned Litton. Litton was the worst. And then, or if they didn't buy them, they gave them huge amounts of money to make those loans. So suddenly, everyone in that neighborhood is a target for a loan. And I say target. And many people, okay, they should have been better educated. Maybe they should have known better. We all should say, if it's too good for true, it's too good for true. But you had a lot of black people buying houses, and on crazy legal terms, where I sat one night with a woman I met in court. She lost her house. We had dinner together. She didn't know where she would live the next day because, frankly, she had let this go to the point that it was beyond help. And I saw her in court, and that was the last. She didn't know when they would come for her. She would say things like, gee, I understand the sheriff will hold your stuff for 10 days. But she didn't know where she would go after those 10 days, where she could store it. And she had bought a house on a mortgage that she thought, I don't know how she could have thought it, she was an intelligent woman, she thought that her flexible rate mortgage would go down after 2 years if she paid seriously, if she paid every payment for 2 years. But in fact, she didn't pay every payment for 2 years because her son was killed, and she thought the mortgage company had agreed that she could skip a couple of payments while she paid for his burial. But in fact, they gave her a very tricky form of modification by which she was paying huge amounts that none of them went to the equity in the house. I mean, the thing was so crazy.
It was a scandal. It was a scandal because these mortgages often were many pages long, tiny print,
right.
legalese. To expect a mortgage broker to always be honestly translating what the mortgage broker themselves often didn't understand into something that a person could get hold of.
She had at one time owned this house out in free and clear. She had borrowed money in order to put down payments for her children. Maybe that was foolish too. When I last looked, 11% of black people had lost their homes. Richard, this is a bigger crisis for black America than the failure of the Freedmen's Bank after the Civil War. It told a whole generation, houses, regular middle class stuff, this is not for you. It is such an enormous transfer of homes to the banks.
Let me pull you out. A next point is something you said when we were talking before the program.
Yeah.
Has it been your experience that the people impacted by what happened in the job, what happened to their savings if they were unemployed for a long time, what happened to their homes, did they understand, as you went around the country interviewing folks, did they understand that they were the victims, the casualties of a social process, of an economy spinning out of control, or did they blame themselves individually? Because it seems to me the impact of a Great Recession will be very different in a culture depending on whether you see it the one way or the other. How did you, tell me how you came to deal with that?
First of all, everybody, even if they have a high social consciousness and they get fired, they don't say, oh, see, that's great, I'm part of look what capitalism is doing to me. Everybody feels bad. But this one was worse because, well, the 4 people from the Pink Slip Club at least had each other, but as the time went by, they couldn't believe it was happening to them. I interviewed a man who was right-wing and Republican, and he very religious, and you can get mad at particular individuals. You can say that person on the job shouldn't have fired me, or you can even say the judge made the wrong decision, or that broker. But you still feel like if I jumped ship at the right time in this company, I wouldn't be the one that was fired. If I'd read that contract, I wouldn't be the one that lost this house. And you just can't help feeling that. Richard, my husband Frank, when Rupert Murdoch bought the New York Post, and they were all fired. I mean, you couldn't want to be the person that Rupert Murdoch kept there, but he was in the hospital twice thinking he was having heart palpitations because he had lost his job and he wouldn't. I mean,
So in a sense,
hurts.
you're saying it's always personal.
It's always personal, but this time there was no group to go to. I mean, if people got angry, they only got angry at some particular individual who they thought was wrong at the particular company at the time they were let go. And even if they were let go with half the company. So it was a very bad feeling. And if you understood that your company was being mean to you and putting the hours up, then you felt, as this very right-wing guy did, that I should have known to go with a different company. I stayed for security, and that's my problem. Or if you quit, you said, I quit, and I should have stayed for security. It's that personal blame is the worst thing, because people are not starving yet. I don't know how they're living, some of the people that I'm talking to, but they're not starving. They even buy takeout coffee. I can't believe people still buy takeout coffee. Nobody carries a thermos. They're not starving like in the last Depression. I mean, well, okay, there are a couple of people sleeping in their cars, and usually there's some other problem why they haven't got some family to hook into. But people are not starving, but their feeling of me, I'm the idiot, that's the most painful thing you could live with. And
you saw that a lot across the country?
So much, and the best thing we could do, the only thing my book could do, really, it's not going to change anybody in the government, is at least let people know that very nice people like them are in the same situation. But the best thing we could do was, of course, fight back. It feels good.
Let me say something about that, because I was struck as I read your book by this. There's a difference between the United States and Europe. We have a lot of things in common, the Europeans and us, but here's a difference. Many more people in Europe seem to understand and believe that what's going on is indeed a social and economic problem, that they're not the cause of it, they're not to blame for it, they are the victims of it, and they're angry that the system works this way, and they're angry that people are getting rich off the misery of others. And that's why in Europe they're out making strikes, they're out in the street, they're demonstrating, they're voting old political parties out of office and trying new ones, whether it's Syriza in Greece or Pepe Grillo in Italy, or all kinds of new developments in politics. We here in the United States, with our so-called individualist tradition, we tend to think of things as an individual problem, an individual issue. And so, as your book shows us, we interpret a firing, an unemployment, a home foreclosure, less as the social economic process that it really is a part of, and more as an act of personal failure or an act of personal error or something like mistake that one makes.
Now, I don't want to give you the wrong, I have plenty of examples. It's not a totally grim book. I mean, there's a lot of people who do a lot of clever things for themselves.
By all means, yes. Individuals try to find
going.
That's right.
But there's a lot of working off the books, too, I might say.
Yeah, people, look, if you think this is an individual problem, you struggle for an individual solution. You move from one part of the country to another. You try to find another job.
You asked me about the housing problem.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a minute.
But you can't move if your house is underwater.
Right, but I think there's a key thing here that we as Americans should understand, that it makes us politically powerless and politically passive to keep thinking of this as an individual problem, to focus all our energies on finding an individual solution, like moving in your job or moving your home or trying to hustle something as a little entrepreneur somewhere. There's an old rule in social thinking. A social problem requires a social solution. A social problem can't be solved by a private individual solution. Even if you solve it for yourself, you leave the social problem for everybody else. We're running out of time, but tell us what your final thought is about housing, if you had that on your mind.
Final thought? Oh, no, I was just going to talk about... I'm not talking about... I had a lot of problems discarding from my book some of the extreme situations and talk about very normal people, friends, children of my friends. I mean, you would have a person, you're going to recognize this person, Richard, a person who did the right thing by investing in themselves and has a student debt. Oh, those student loans from that period, 8.25%, and you cannot negotiate it down. You can't change it. You can't refinance it. But they were very normal. They did normal things. They ran up these debts. They tried to pay the debts down. That same couple, they did what they were supposed to do. They bought a starter house, the cheapest house in the neighborhood. They were not unemployed. They were two teachers, two private school, but elementary school teachers, loved what they were doing, didn't even lose their jobs. But when the job became insecure, and they both were able to find jobs in another city, and they went to sell their house and discovered that if they would succeed in selling it at today's prices, they would still owe the bank about $200,000. So, they have to try to work out something to do. In economic terms, you can read in the Financial Times that this will make the American working class less mobile. In other words, I can't get these workers to move for me fast enough. But their personal situation was so heartbreaking. They're paying $400 on the student loan. They're paying $3,000 on the old house, $1,100 to live someplace else. And they're normal. They did what they were supposed to do. And if I had any satisfaction from this book, it was one lady who read it and said, "Thank you. Secretly, I tried not to say anything, but I felt that my daughter and son-in-law were just sort of failed yuppies. They have all these debts, and because they're not living right." And I read this book, and I saw, in dollars and cents, it doesn't add up. It's different when I went to school and bought a house. And so if I made one person be able to make a rapprochement with her family, she said, I confess to them what they always must have sensed and apologize for what I always must have been giving off the vibes you don't manage well. So my book helped one family on a personal solution.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm sure it'll help many because it is a lesson to people. It's a very costly thing for a society. If people take a social problem and rather than attack it with a social solution and a social movement to reach the solution, blame themselves. It's not only bad for you individually, it's bad for the people around you, the people who love you and that you love, because it eats into you in a way you might avoid if you were part of something that tried to change the society, which is the source of this difficulty. Thank you very much, Barbara. I wish we had more time, as we always say, but we don't. So, folks, if you're interested in hearing about and reading about the personal experiences, down the Up Escalator, Barbara Garson. In our time remaining, quickly now, first I want to congratulate a new worker co-op, just formed now in the Mission District of San Francisco. It used to be called Rosie's Restaurant, and it's now going to be called Maya Luna. The former Rosie's Restaurant was a typical capitalist business. Employer on the one hand, employees on the other. Now it changed for a whole host of reasons. The owner, the former employer, has reorganized the business as a co-op. All of the 8 people who work there, the cooks, the servers, and so on, are now equal owners, equal decision makers. They've decided that their future is cooperative. And they took an interesting step. They brought in the community that had been eating there, and they produced an immense array of foods because they wanted a cooperative customers to decide what the menu should be. What do you like the most? What do you want us to cook? Cooperative consumer working together with a cooperative producer, a worker co-op. Interesting developments happening all over the United States, and now also in the Mission District, a restaurant in San Francisco. 2 questions that I have time to answer. The first comes from Tiffany. Thank you, Tiffany, for letting us use your name. And she makes a description very appropriate to what Barbara has been telling us about the difficulties of looking for a job in this economy. Her bad experiences, the lack of a real personal response, rejections that don't explain very much and don't seem fair. What do you do about it, she wants to know. Well, I could answer that you could have a much better unemployment system than we do. You could do much more to have more offices, to have them staffed with better trained and more people, to have real follow-up, real help in finding an employer and working with an employer. These are important things that could be done. But that's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is we oughtn't to have this many people needing an unemployment office. Remember the fundamental irrationality that Barbara Garson's book is dealing with. We have a society with enormous social problems that needs rebuilding cities, rebuilding schools, building the facilities for our elderly and for our children, and so on. We have millions of unemployed people who want to work. We have all the raw materials, tools, and equipment that they need to work on and work with. Any rational economic system would put together the people who want to work in the jobs they want, working with the tools and equipment that are sitting there gathering rust and dust to produce the output we all know we need. This is an economic system that fails. If it did its job, if it did the job that any rational economic system ought to do, then we wouldn't need unemployment offices except rarely and for few people. So rather than improve them, much as they need improvement, just the way Tiffany says, we really ought to deal with the larger problem that would make the question of unemployment offices much less of an issue than they are now. Last point. Question from Ben Sampson from London, one of our listeners overseas. He questions deflation. The situation when prices and wages go down. Japan in particular has been fighting a deflation and has just decided to pump up the money supply in their society precisely to offset the risks of a continuing or worsening deflation. And Ben Sampson asks, why is a deflation a problem? Why is a falling set of prices a problem? Well, let's answer quickly. A falling set of prices, when you look around and the prices of everything are falling, your wages and the prices of goods, leads people to make a logical decision. Don't purchase today, because if you wait a month, half a year, it will be cheaper. Don't buy your car now. Don't buy your appliance now. Don't buy your home now. Everything's going down. So here's the irony. When a deflation begins to set in, people stop their purchases, hold back their purchases. But, of course, that means the producers lay off workers. In other words, it produces an economic downturn as everybody reacts to the deflation by cutting their purchases. Number two, it hurts profits. Companies are spending money now, hiring workers, buying equipment, buying a truck at a price that is high, but it'll take a months or a year to produce the output, by which time, since prices are going down, they're not going to get for the output what they thought they would get. They had to spend the input price when prices were higher. Over time, they get lower. They won't be able to make a profit. They will cut back. Well, if buyers cut back and producers cut back, you have an economic downturn. Very scary if you allow prices to go down. Last point. It's terrible for debtors. If you owe $1,000, it's one thing if your salary is at a certain level and you can assume it's going to continue. But a deflation means that not just prices, but wages are coming down. But your debt is fixed in money terms, $1,000. So as your wages go down, the burden of the debt in your life goes up. So deflations are terrible for debtors because they make the real burden of the debt higher. Well, we're the most indebted we've ever been in this country in the terms of the working people of America. We have housing debt, car debt, credit card debt, and student loan debt. And all of those will become much more burdensome if the wages and prices of Americans fall. The interesting thing is, it's the opposite when we have an inflation. At that point, it's good for debtors because the real cost of your loan is shrinking. And it's good for producers. So whether we have a deficit or a credit, or an inflation, is usually a question of who's stronger. All the people who don't want a deficit or all the people who don't want, a deflation versus all the people who don't want an inflation. It's no outcome that anybody controls. It's a question of the forces in a society that produce one kind of imbalance or another. And it's usually a sign of a society spinning out of control when you have a serious deflation or a serious inflation. But deflation is usually considered the scariest of the two options. Thank you very much for being with me on Economic Update. This is Richard Wolff. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Barbara Garson. Do take a look at her new book and understand the depth on a personal level of the economic crisis we're living through. I look forward to being with you again next week.